Hello everyone. Birth and spread of communalism in India. With the rise of nationalism, communalism appeared around the end of the 19th century. It proved to be a huge threat to the unity of the Indian people and the national movement. The legacy unfortunately continues. Characteristic features of Indian communalism. Communalism, more accurately, sectarianism, is basically an ideology which gives more importance to one's own ethnic religious group rather than to the wider society as a whole, evolved through three broad stages in India. Communal nationalism. The notion that since a group or a section of people belong to a particular religious community, their secular interests are the same, that is, even those matters which have got nothing to do with religion affect all of them equally. Liberal communism. The notion that since two religious communities have different religious interests, they have different interests in the secular sphere also, that is, in economic, political, and cultural spheres. Extreme communalism. The notion that not only do different religious communities have different interests, but also that these interests are incompatible. That is, two communities cannot coexist because the interests of one community come into conflict with those of the other. There is nothing unique about Indian communalism. It was a result of the conditions which have in other societies produced similar phenomena and ideologies such as fascism, anti-Semitism, racism, the Catholic Protestant conflict in Northern Ireland, and the Christian Muslim conflict in Lebanon. Bypassing basic economic interests, the communalists claim to protect interests which do not necessarily exist. Communalism is a modern phenomenon rooted in the modern social, economic, and political colonial structure that emerged out of modern politics based on mass mobilization and popular participation. Modern politics made it necessary for people to have wider links and loyalties and to form established identities. This process involved the spread of modern ideas of nation, class, and cultural linguistic identity. In India, religious consciousness was transformed into communal consciousness in some parts of the country and among some sections of the people. Its social roots lay in the rising middle classes who propagated imaginary communal interests to further their own economic interests. Communalism was a bourgeois question par excellence according to the left. Communalists were backed in their communal campaign by the colonial administration. It was the channel through which colonialists expanded their social base. Communalists and colonialists were helped in their sinister motives by the fact that often socio-economic distinctions in Indian society coincided with religious distinctions. The inherent class contradictions were given a post facto communal coloring by the vested interests. Creative, conservative, social, reactionary elements gave full support to communalism. Religiosity itself did not amount to communalism, but in a country where lack of education and low awareness of the outside world was a sad reality, religion had the potential of becoming and was used as a vehicle of communalism. Reasons for growth of communalism. Communalism grew in the modern economic, political, and social institutions where new identities were emerging in a haphazard manner, even as the old pre modern identities had not diminished. A clash of this fundamental dichotomy gave rise to a communal ideology. Socio-economic reasons. Religion did not actually dictate the economic and political interests of the Hindus and Muslims. One community consisting of Hindus as well as Muslims differed from another, also consisting of Hindus and Muslims by language, culture, caste, social status, food and dress habits, social practices or customs, and so on. Even socially and culturally, the Hindu and the Muslim masses had developed a common ways of life. A Bengali Muslim has much more in common with a Bengali Hindu than with a Punjabi Muslim. Moreover, Hindus and the Muslims were equal victims of oppression and exploitation by British imperialism. Modern Western thought and scientific ideas were not absorbed by Muslim intellectuals who remained traditional and backward. Even when, as a result of the efforts of reformers, modern education spread among Muslims, the proportion of the educated was far lower among Muslims than among Hindus, Parsis, or Christians. The Muslims also lagged behind as participants in the growth of trade and industry. As the number of educated persons and men of trade and industry among the Muslims was rather small, it was easy for the reactionary big landlords and the richer classes to continue to wield influence over the Muslim masses. Landlords and zamindars, whether Hindu or Muslim, supported the British rule out of self-interest. But among the Hindus, the modern intellectuals and the rising commercial and industrialist class had taken over the leadership from the old order of landlords. The educated Muslims found few opportunities in business or the professions. They inevitably looked for government employment. The British officials and the loyalist Muslim leaders incited the educated Muslims against the educated Hindus. Syed Ahmad Khan and others demanded special treatment for the Muslims in the matter of government service on the one hand, and on the other told the Muslims that if the educated Muslims remained loyal to the British, the latter would reward them with government jobs and other special favors. The same arguments were used by some loyalist Hindus and Parsis with regard to their people, but they were in a small minority. As a result of the underdevelopment due to colonial policies, there was a lack of industrial development, hence, unemployment was an acute problem in India, especially for the educated, and there was an intense competition for existing jobs. In the circumstances, there were advocates of short sighted and short term solutions such as reservation in jobs on communal, provincial, or caste lines. These persons aroused communal and religious and later caste and provincial passions in an attempt to get larger share of the existing limited employment opportunities. It was easy for those desperately searching for jobs for employment to fall prey to such ideas. Because of the economic backwardness of India and rampant unemployment, there was ample scope for the colonial government to use concessions, favors, and reservations to fuel communal and separatist tendencies. Also, modern political consciousness was late in developing among the Muslims, and the dominance of traditional reactionary elements over the Muslim masses helped a communal outlook to take root. There was talk of Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism. Politically immature, many Hindus as well as Muslims did not realize that the economic, educational, and cultural difficulties they were experiencing were born out of their subjection to foreign rule and because of economic underdevelopment. British policy of divide and rule. Muslims were generally looked upon with suspicion initially, especially after the Wahhabi and 1857 revolts, and were subjected to repression and discrimination by the British government. Also, the introduction of English education had undermined Arabic and Persian learning, which added further to the economic backwardness and exclusion of the Muslims from service. After the 1870s, with signs of the emergence of Indian nationalism and growing politicization of the educated middle classes, the government reversed its policy of repression of Muslims and instead decided to rally them behind the government through concessions, favors, and reservations and used them against nationalist forces. The government used persons like Syed Ahmad Khan to counter the growing influence of the Congress. Syed Ahmad Khan had a broad minded and reformist outlook initially, but later he started supporting the colonial government, exhorting the Muslim masses to stay away from the Congress and not to get politicized. He also started talking of separate interests of Hindu and Muslims. Communalism in history writing, initially suggested by imperialist historians and later adopted by some chauvinist Indian historians, the communal interpretation of Indian history portrayed the ancient phase of the Hindu phase and the medieval phase, which included the rule of the Turks, Afghans, and the Mughals, as the Muslim phase. The conflicts of ruling classes during the medieval phase were distorted and exaggerated as Hindu Muslim conflicts. Historians ignore the fact that the politics, ancient and medieval, as of all times and anywhere, was based on economic and political interests and not on religious considerations. It was in the interest of the British and communal historians to refuse to acknowledge the notion of a composite culture in India. On its part, the Hindu communal view of history chose to project the view that Indian society and culture had reached ideal heights in the ancient period from which they began to decay in the medieval period because of Muslim rule. In this, there was a refusal to acknowledge how Indian economy and technology, religion and philosophy, arts and literature, culture and society had developed and been enriched in the medieval period. Side effects of socio-religious reform movements. Reform movements such as the Wahhabi movement among the Muslims and Shuddhi among Hindus, with their militant overtones, made the role of religion more vulnerable to communalism. Reforms at times were seen as process of insulating one community from the influence of another religious community. Side effects of militant nationalism. The early nationalists made conscious efforts to remove minority fears. Dadabhai Nauroji, presiding over the Second Congress session 1886, declared the intentions of the Congress not to raise socio-religious questions in its forums. In 1889, the Congress decided not to take up any issue opposed by the Muslims. But later, with the coming of militant nationalism, a distinct Hindu nationalism was palpable in the nationalist politics. For instance, Tilak's Ganapati and Shivaji festivals and anti-cow slaughter campaigns created much suspicion. Aurobindo's vision of an Aryanized world, the Swadeshi movement with elements like dips in the Ganga and revolutionary activity with oath taking before goddesses were hardly likely to enthuse Muslims into these campaigns in a big way. The communal element in the Lucknow Pact 1916 and the Khilafat agitation 1920-22 was too visible to be of insignificant consequences. When the Khilafat question came up, there was unease among some congressmen who felt that the issue was not really nationalistic. The fight against imperialistic Britain in this case was not about the economic and political consequences of imperialism, but on the ground that the Caliph and some holy places of Islam were being threatened. The Muslim sympathy for Turkey was on religious grounds. Even later, the heroes and myths and cultural traditions the Muslims appeared to belong to not to the history of India but to the history of West Asia. Though this tendency did not immediately clash with Indian nationalism, but in fact made its supporters anti imperialistic in the longer term, It encouraged the habit of looking at political questions from a religious point of view. Communal reaction by majority community. The communalism met with a reaction from the majority community. From the 1870s itself, some Hindu zamindars, moneylenders, and middle class professionals began to give expression to anti Muslim sentiments. They went to the extent of declaring that the British had liberated the land from Muslim tyranny and saved the Hindus from the oppression by Muslims. The cause of Hindi was given a communal color by saying that Urdu was the language of the Muslims, which was not historically quite correct. Then came organizations to promote a communal outlook. The Punjab Hindu Sabha, founded in 1909 by U.N. Mukherjee and Lal Chand, opposed the Congress for trying to unite Indians of all colors into a single nation. They argued that Hindus should side with the colonial government in their fight against Muslims. The All India Hindu Mahasabha held its first session in April 1915 with the Maharaja of Kasim Bazar as president. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh (RSS) was established in 1925. However, Hindu communalism was not a strong force for a long time, as the modern secular intelligentsia and middle class among Hindus wielded a greater influence. This was not the case with the Muslims. The Muslim communal elements, landlords, traditional religious leaders, and bureaucrats exercised a lot of influence on the Muslims. The one-upmanship of different versions of communal tendencies was a factor which deterred any effective counter-offensive against communalism. Like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you. Bye.